You guys remember the show House?
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation. No, but in all seriousness, House is one of my favorite shows of all time, and I'm going to try to explain why. I've always loved this show, but I could never quite articulate precisely why, so a while back I opened up Word and decided to let it all out.
Just let it out, you'll feel better.
After writing about 11 pages worth of stuff, I decided to turn it into a video essay instead. So throughout this video I use way more clips from the show than I probably should have, but I don't plan on monetizing this anyway. There are some heavy spoilers, although I avoid talking about the finale and some other key plot points. I would argue, however, that plot, while good, isn't the beauty of this show. So if you've never seen the show, continue at your own discretion. It's been 7 years since House ended, and I still find it as hard-hitting and relevant to my life as ever. And no, I'm not saying I crashed my car into my ex's house, although... What I'm saying is House has easily become one of my favorite shows of all time. Her life lessons, inspirational moments, psychological analyses, and social commentary may have well as made this show a therapy session. House is a complex and fleshed out character that I related to on a level I didn't realize was possible. So where do I even begin? Well, House just isn't a show for me. It's an emotional pillar, one that was able to get me through good and bad times. I want to dig deeper into what exactly it was that made this show so special for me, and I'm sure many others. But that being said, I'm flayed, and I'm going to do my best to put into words exactly why I love this show. About 5 or so years ago, I noticed that House had been added to Netflix's catalog. I had seen a few episodes as a kid when they originally aired, but they didn't appeal to me at the time. In fact, I thought they were too predictable, and I was too young to properly appreciate what they were going for. I was looking for the next show to fill the existential hole in my life that Lost had left. Fucking Lost. Which, by the way, is a phenomenal show you should check out if you haven't already seen it. A lot of people have a problem with the ending or the crazy writing, but there's an explanation for it all if you look hard enough. Yes, it all happened. No, they weren't all dreaming or in purgatory, but I digress. I decided to give House a shot. After the typical cold opening of some person falling ill and the amazing intro by Massive Attack,
No! God!
there we go, that's the one. It cuts to House and his colleague / only friend Wilson walking the hospital halls discussing the patient.
See that? They all assume that I'm impatient because of this cane.
So put on a white coat like the rest of us.
I don't want him to think I'm a doctor.
You see where the administration might have a problem with that attitude.
People don't want a sick doctor.
Well, that's fair enough. I don't like healthy patients. The 29-year-old female...
One who can't talk, I like that part.
She's my cousin.
And your cousin doesn't like the diagnosis. I wouldn't either. Brain tumor. She's gonna die. Boring.
Shouldn't we be speaking to the patient before we start diagnosing?
Is she a doctor?
No, but
Everybody lies.
Dr. House doesn't like dealing with patients.
isn't treating patients why we became doctors?
No, treating illnesses is why we became doctors. Treating patients is what makes most doctors miserable.
So you're trying to eliminate the humanity from the practice of medicine?
If we don't talk to them, they can't lie to us. And we can't lie to them. Humanity is overrated. I don't think it's a tumor.
First year medical school, if you hear hoofbeats, you think horses, not zebras.
Are you in first year medical school? No.
Now this first scene tells you almost all you need to know about the character. He's a self-assertive, sarcastic, indifferent doctor who hates dealing with people and lives by the worldview that everybody lies. His attire and his attitude tell you that he clearly doesn't sit well with conformity or really care what people think. And his limp and cane tells you that there's likely a story to be told. It's a great introduction to the character. I knew I was in for a treat. So let's start with the characters. It didn't take me too long to fall in love. House's brash yet hyper-rational and analytical personality reminded me a lot of myself. The scenes were fun and entertaining, but yet had enough drama to keep you hooked, wondering what would happen next. And I quickly grew attached to them all. House was acerbic and cruel, or at least appeared to be, but he did it in such a way that it was hard to argue it wasn't effective. I mean, he was brutally honest, and those more mentally fragile might even consider him a bully.
I hate bullies. You work for me.
You're not a bully.
Pretty sure I am, dickwad.
And this brutal honesty is something that I, and I'm sure many others, admired. As Tao put it, you relentlessly mock, but it's not for self-aggrandizement, it's because ideas are bigger than feelings. House is never mean just for the sake of being mean, as every time he has a quick put down or insult someone, it's purposeful. Often it's to make a point or argue a case for some necessary medical treatment, and other times it's to point out hypocrisy or try to get someone to see the flaws in themselves or their logic. And all this is usually wrapped up with effective humor. House's sharp wit and intellect drew me into the character. His over-the-top nature was hilarious and relatable.
It's either that or a reflex response.
What happened?
His colleagues and employees are all too used to his shenanigans, and it doesn't even really faze them anymore. They just know that's how he is. This is pretty relatable to me, as all my coworkers are all too used to my mischievous behavior. The way he so quickly came up with structured arguments and rebuttals or critique of someone's belief or defense of his own worldview was magnificent. It felt like he was echoing my views on a lot of things, just articulated better and more humorously.
Patriotism is natural. We've always relied on our tribes to keep us safe. It's helpful for society if its members have positive feelings about that society.
Iranian women? Drag queens in Uganda? Patriotism is nothing but loyalty to real estate that's been conquered 800 times by 800 different regimes with 800 different cultures. But each time, it's just the best. I claim this burger in the name of Queen Isabella of Spain.
Then there's the original Dream Team, Chase, Cameron, and Foreman. Whoops. Chase starts off as this subservient, sometimes saint-like character, but he evolves throughout the show. The more the show progresses, the more he starts to show qualities that resemble that of House. And this happens to most of the characters that work with him, but it's most noticeable with Chase and Foreman. Foreman initially shares some of House's qualities, but not as refined. He can be cold and calculated, but he doesn't possess the skill or wit that House does. And he's almost always selfish, whereas House can sometimes be self-sacrificing. Sometimes. He serves as the challenger to House's ideas and tries to set himself up as his moral arbiter. I mean, he does change throughout the show, but he also remains consistent as the hard ass who needs to feel in charge and prove himself. Easily my least favorite character. Cameron is much more compassionate and challenges House morally. She sees the good in everyone, including House. She wants to save whatever humanity is left in him. Their dynamic worked really well, and this original trio was a great introduction into the series. Then there's the writing. It's phenomenal. A lot of people tend to view this as another medical show, which I guess technically it is, but I would argue that this show isn't about medicine at all. If you watch the show looking for 100% medical accuracy and realism, you're going to be disappointed. Although they get a lot right, the cases are far-fetched and there's plenty of leisure taken with the accuracy of medical procedures in violation of almost every code of ethics in existence. But the medicine is simply a storytelling device. At its heart, the show is about people and how complex and interesting they can be.
In many ways, I didn't think of it as a medical show, ultimately. It was a show about people.
The show's strength lies not in the everyday dramas, but rather in the interpersonal. All of the characters are fairly intelligent. They all have unique views on the world, which can make for interesting, thought-provoking conversations between them. And despite often having a niche, all of the characters maintain a high level of realism. Each character has some problem or vice that they work on overcoming. Nobody on the show is perfect. It's a common theme within the writing. The casting in the show is stellar. Every actor played their part perfectly. And if you pay attention, the dialogue is effective and clever, a product of really good writing.
I'm not always nice. I'm not nice to you.
Because you know nice bores me. Hence, still nice.
The script is so well crafted that there's actually a book written about the various forms of being untruthful through irony, deception, and humor, and the author uses dialogue entirely from House to demonstrate its points. The show is also really funny, but unlike sitcoms, it possesses a quality of verisimilitude. The writing, combined with Laurie's sharp delivery, made for comedy gold.
What's the test say?
As I suspected, you have significant losses in the upper right quadrant of your visual field.
Are you serious?
No, it's a joke. Two guys go into a bar, and one has significant losses in the upper right quadrant of his visual field, and the other one says you're going to need an MRI to confirm the type and location of the tumor.
We've got rectal bleeding.
What, all of you?
What is this?
He's not a what, he's a who. They even have the right to vote now.
I say we assume House was right about the anaphylaxis.
It is tempting.
Heart failure could be either infection, coronary disease, or rejection.
Sorry. There's a reason they call it the whiteboard. It's not my rule.
Now, as funny as I find this, it's actually a point of contention for a lot of people. Either you get his humor or you don't. as some people find it too strange, ridiculous, or harsh, in bad taste. But if it's your cup of tea, then it's amazing. The character's acerbic wit, combined with his delivery of the repartee and clever one-liners in the perfect sarcastic voice, is remarkable. He isn't afraid to be blunt or boorish, yet in a humorous way. He says what we all wish we could tell our boss or annoying customer at work without regret. However, when he needs to get serious, he is very much capable of doing so, and he can deliver emotionally impactful moments. Most other dramas tend to focus on multiple characters and have an overarching storyline, like Grey's Anatomy, or maybe a more fitting example would be Breaking Bad. But House is a procedural show, so its main focus was on the character of House himself. Now, I didn't mind this as much, as I'm not really a fan of soap operas, and I love the character so much that I wanted it to be explored thoroughly. And Laurie nailed it. I mean, he absorbed this character into his very being. He embodied it. He became it. He understood just what the character was, and he executed it masterfully. From the expressions and subtle touches that he added, right down to the accent. His American accent is so convincing you would never suspect he was not one. Upon viewing his audition tape, everyone knew that he was the perfect fit. Bryan Singer, one of the producers, even ironically said, "This is what we need, an American guy." Imagine a sardonic, hubristic House, but with an English accent.
Oh, how terribly foolish of me, Doctor. Is it that late? Yes, I'm calling from London, you see. Must have got my times mixed up, so...
The stereotype that British accents get of being more trustworthy and nice would likely have put a damper on what the character was meant to be. To quote dialect coach Eric Singer, accents are a crucial part of storytelling. And Laurie told that story well. Although House spends the majority of the show seemingly not caring about anyone but himself, there are those few heartfelt moments that really carry power to them. Because House is so reticent and often indifferent, when those few acts of kindness do happen and his emotions get coaxed into the light, it means so much more. There's a point in which he is antagonizing Foreman and his recently released convict brother, who Foreman despises, manipulating them and toying with them until they can take no more. What on the surface appears to be pure malevolence is later revealed by Wilson to be well-intentioned. He was becoming the common enemy that the brothers could bond over, which they did. As Wilson put it, "You're a diabolical, benevolent puppet master." House, of course, denies this was ever his intent, and he does this more often than people realize. He simply disguises it as having an ulterior motive. When the veil of quick-witted comebacks and insults is peeled back and he gives genuine advice or comfort, it is extremely powerful. Then there's his friendship with Wilson, one of my favorite television bromances. Right alongside there with Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter. Wilson understands him better than anyone. He's his Watson to his Holmes. I have a weak spot for two characters whose dynamics are completely opposite but yet inexplicably have an unbreakable bond. House being this apparent misanthrope who doesn't care for his patients and only cares about the puzzle, and is selfish and rude in every way imaginable, with seemingly no respect for even their friendship. Wilson, on the other hand, being an oncologist who cares deeply for his patients and wears his heart on his sleeve. He's almost never selfish, and he puts up with House's crap and is potentially even too caring. I mean, for fuck's sake, he donated a part of his liver to a patient. And yet they are best friends. On the surface, it shouldn't work, but yet it does. Wilson understands House and is able to look past the facade of the cold-hearted automaton that House presents himself as. And House knows Wilson is special and understands him and puts up with his antics. Mutual respect, and they strengthen each other in their weaknesses. It's admirable. We all need ourselves a Wilson, someone who understands us. And as much as they may hate each other at times or claim not to need each other, when all is said and done, they know they do. House needs Wilson to keep him grounded, to make sure his humanity isn't permanently buried away underneath the haze of his Vicodin addiction. And Wilson, despite not wanting to admit it, has fun with House. He enjoys his antics and the situations they find themselves in. It takes him away from the ordinary monotony that is life. There aren't many times where you see House genuinely happy, but those few times that you do, it's usually with Wilson. Or when he's playing music on his guitar or his piano, it's his escape. The finale is one of the most heart-wrenching yet heartwarming things I've ever seen. It shows you just how strong their friendship really is. I won't go into it in case you've made it this far in the video and haven't seen the end of the show, or maybe it's just been so long you forgot the details. So instead, let's check out this scene. After having been mad at House and claiming that they were no longer friends, which really upset House, at the end of the episode he walks in, punches House in the face, and then nonchalantly asks,
Dinner later? I'll pick something up.
I feel like that scene perfectly encapsulates the relationship that I am admittedly envious of. Their friendship ranges from over-the-top pranks.
Wow. Looks like somebody filed halfway through your cane while you were sleeping. No.
to more serious, heartfelt exchanges.
The operation is in 2 hours, and I'd like you to be there with me.
No.
What? Why?
Because if you die, I'm alone.
Another thing I love about this show is just how deep and hard-hitting it can get. Not just emotionally, like most shows. There are so many powerful things said or shown about life that make you really stop and think. I'd be lying if I said I didn't tear up multiple times throughout the series. To quote someone from the House subreddit, just finished rewatching the show, and from a therapist's view, the complete series is terribly beautiful. The cases are often ridiculous, sure, and there's plenty of added drama, but the portrayal of mental illness, pain, depression, addiction, suicide, and dying hit very close to home with me. I thought much of these issues were portrayed realistically and accurately. I was tearful at the end and just wanted to express my feelings of what a painful, uplifting, and terrible beauty this show was. More on these moments in a bit, but let's talk first about when it does this more subtly. Through sheer character building and brilliant acting, it has the ability to say so much while saying so little. For example, when House's father passes away and House seems not to care, his relationship with him was never great and House isn't an emotional person to begin with. However, at the end of the episode, House and Wilson are about to leave the hospital, and House simply says, "Wilson." Wilson turns around, "Yeah?" House looks him in the eye and just states, "My dad's dead." To which Wilson replies, "Yeah, my sympathies." House simply nods and they continue on their way. As strange as this would seem in any other context, we know this was House's way of finally letting it out. It often drops little nuggets of wisdom or things to consider. Like the time House and Wilson are discussing a patient who is gay, but he's adamant that he is turned straight. House, quote, "Wisdom is knowing the difference between what you can change and what you were born with," end quote. I feel like it keeps more sharper viewers watching actively rather than passively. Yes, but cowardice is labeling what you don't want to change as innate. Wilson counters before House has an epiphany and leaves the room, avoiding the conversation entirely. What parts of us can we actually change, and what parts of ourselves are immutable? Are there things about myself that I would indeed like to change, but simply rationalize it as being just who I am? We have all changed in some way over time, whether it be for better or for worse. When I originally lost my faith as an adolescent, it drastically altered the way I viewed the world, and one of these was my newfound love for truth. It became almost an obsession, and remains so to this day. I realized that I had believed this fallacious nonsense my entire life, which meant everything I knew was fallible. So I re-examined all my convictions, and I approached new claims with a veracity like I never did before. House's mode of reasoning is almost identical to mine, and is likely the biggest reason I admired the character. He approaches everything with a very analytical mode of reasoning, valuing truth above all else, and not letting emotion cloud his objectivity, although sometimes this is unavoidable. Every claim proposed to him must be rationally explained and proven. Superstitious claims irk him to his core, and he is very proficient at disabusing people of these silly notions. And there are a plethora of times during the show where he unapologetically goes after religion. There's even a point in the series in which he purposely has a near-death experience just to prove that there is no afterlife. Yes, I realize how insane and over the top this is, even for a show, but I feel like this is also the epitome of House's compulsive need for answers. And I can somewhat empathize with this, as the few times I have had a close brush with death, a small part of me wished that I had died just for a brief moment to let people know that what I did or didn't see could be rationally explained. Although I know this wouldn't be enough for most of my kin. House is brazen, and he simply does not care about offending the convictions of others.
Why is it so difficult for you to believe in God?
What I have difficulty with is the whole concept of belief. Faith isn't based on logic, on experience.
I experience God on a daily basis. He is always with me.
You can have all the faith you want in spirits and the afterlife and heaven and hell. But when it comes to this world, don't be an idiot. Because you can tell me that you put your faith in God to get you through the day, but when it comes time to cross the road, I know you look both ways.
Beautiful. Very few other shows have the audacity to challenge such strongly held beliefs, especially using the main character. But this show, much like its protagonist, simply does not like to follow the rules, and it's something I applaud them for. They tackle things like religion, anti-vaxxers, and a number of other superstitions head on. It's always great to watch the show with someone who I know to be religious to their core, and when a scene like this arises, I can see the wheels in their brain turning, if even for a moment. Given the popularity of the show, I imagine it made millions at least briefly re-examine some convictions. As mentioned earlier, this show can get really hard-hitting, and one of the most profound episodes, in my opinion, is one Laurie actually directed himself. It doesn't follow the usual episodic procedure, and instead the hospital is put on lockdown and House ends up stuck in a terminal patient's room. The patient happens to be a case that House rejected for not being interesting enough, and House, perhaps feeling guilt, offers to turn up the morphine to a lethal dose to end his suffering. After the patient declines, he offers the morphine to House, after noticing he was in pain due to his leg. House informs him that he only takes ibuprofen now because he had a drug problem and that there isn't any on hand. He tells him that he thinks the arterial wall is damaged and that he needs an arteriogram to confirm, which he hasn't had yet.
You don't want the test. In case the arterial wall is fine, which would mean that the pain is coming from something else. What's her name?
Interesting that you jump from physical pain to long-lost love. You're projecting. So what's her name?
It's my daughter.
I love this dialogue. It's mesmerizing watching two broken yet sharp-witted human beings go back and forth with each other. After House deduces that the patient must be waiting on someone to call or visit, the patient tells him that it's his daughter. He abandoned her as a child and is looking for some sort of closure. He then asks House to reciprocate and tell him his story.
That's my story. What's yours?
Same thing, pretty much.
I'm going to be dead in a few hours. Your secrets couldn't be safer. Unless you're keeping them from yourself.
Unless you're keeping them from yourself. And for whatever reason, that line struck a chord with me. Sometimes you really don't want to face yourself. It's hard to say things out loud that deep down you already know. They become real. And then House does just that. He opens up.
I like being alone. At least I convinced myself that I'm better off that way. And then I met someone in a psychiatric hospital, of all places. She changed me. And then she left. We're better off alone. We suffer alone, we die alone. Doesn't matter if you're a model husband or father of the year. Tomorrow will be the same for you.
But yesterday would have been different.
That gets me every time. The actor who played the patient did it brilliantly, and Hugh, of course, did equally fantastic. You can see the pain in their eyes and feel the connection that they share in that moment. They have both lost someone they care deeply for. They have both alienated people from their lives, and House is perhaps seeing his future in him. Tomorrow will be the same for you. It doesn't matter who you are. When you die alone. The party of life continues for everyone else, and you are forced to leave. But yesterday would have been different. You might die alone, but what really matters in those last moments is what you did along the way. The relationships you've built and broken, the experiences you've shared. For a brief moment, he has opened himself up to someone. I like being alone, or at least I convince myself I'm better off that way. One of my favorite episodes. It felt so poignant to me. I saw a lot of myself in that scene. Am I simply justifying my reticence to seek deeper relationships with people, or do I actually prefer being alone, pondering different aspects of my life? Although I am currently locked away in my room in the middle of the night, ignoring everyone and everything to write this script instead of being a normal person and having a healthy social life. Someone passed a Vicodin.
We had a very specific...
My introversion and need for seclusion constantly battle with the part of me that enjoys the company of others and building relationships. I want to enjoy life to the best of my abilities, but I'm not always sure exactly what that encompasses. I don't want to have regrets. I think that most people will feel this way with some aspect of the show or another, something that gives you pause and makes you reevaluate some belief that you hold or situation that you currently find yourself in. Everybody lies. A quote that is nearly synonymous with House at this point. He knows he can't trust others, so he learns the objective ways in which the universe operates and uses it to his advantage. This is why he's so good at observation and deduction. He knows almost instantly when someone lies to him.
I'm not fighting with my wife. I had a flat tire. It's in my trunk. You can go look at it if you want.
Don't need to. Face tells me you're bluffing. Not yours, Chase's.
He notices things almost no one else would even consider or give thought to. He's a master at reading people. I love doing this with people. Observing, analyzing people's behaviors and choice of words, and then making logical deductions or inductions. I never knew what it was called though, it was just one of my peculiarities. So when I first seen the show, it was a relief to see someone else obsess over seemingly frivolous details as well. Eventually, it led me down the rabbit hole of discovering Sherlock Holmes and the science of deduction. Admittedly, a lot of the deductive science out there is pretentious Sherlock fandom stuff, but it's not hard to weed out actual useful information. The character itself was based on Sherlock Holmes, and there are myriad parallels to the Sherlock canon. The name of the show for starters, House Holmes. You get the point. Not to mention his obsession with mysteries, lacking a capacity for dealing with people, being a genius with a vast eclectic knowledge base, and perhaps most salient his proficiency in deductive reasoning. The Sherlock shows, however, highly exaggerate the abilities and feats one will be able to accomplish with this skill set.
And says wife, not girlfriend. She must have given it to him recently. This model's only 6 months old. Marriage in trouble then. 6 months on, he's just given it away. If she'd left him, he would have kept it. People do sentiment, but no, he wanted rid of it. He left her. He gave the phone to you. That says he wants you to stay in touch. You're looking for cheap accommodation, and you're not going to your brother for help. It says you've got problems with him. Maybe you liked his wife. Maybe you don't like his drinking.
How can you possibly know about the drinking?
Shot in the dark. Good one, though. Power connection, tiny little scuff marks around the edge of it. Every night he goes to plug it in to charge, but his hands are shaking. You never see those marks on a sober man's phone, never see a drunk's without them. There you go, see, you were right.
I was right. Right about what?
The police don't consult amateurs.
I love this show, and while this is entertaining, it's also meretricious. Some of the deductions of this series are extremely far-fetched and require a big suspension of disbelief. The phone charging deduction being a common point of ridicule for those who aren't a big fan of BBC's Sherlock. But overall, it's still a great show. I mean, Darin Brown was on the show. He played himself. Can't get much better than that. But House, on the other hand, tones these skills down to a more realistic degree.
Talk to your daughter.
What?
Your pants, your blouse, your scarf are all freshly dry cleaned. Everything except your jacket. It's got smudge on it. Probably 2 days old. Which means you didn't know the jacket had been worn. So, either your husband is a cross-dresser, or your daughter's been borrowing your clothes without telling you. Probably wants to look older to get into bars.
I don't have a daughter.
Next.
A much more tame, but yet still impressive level of proficiency. I love the scenes in which House masks something he knew all along as some impressive deduction, much like Sherlock does on occasion. My favorite thing, though, is when he brings this prowess into his clinic duty hours. I mean, House on clinic duty deserves a spin-off all on its own. Even though House is made out as this know-it-all genius, they still show the more candid side of this type of character, making him more down-to-earth and relatable. Like sometimes showing how he sets up jokes or pranks that would otherwise make him seem omniscient. House isn't the only character who's good at reading verbal and nonverbal communication, however. As I mentioned before, most of the characters are relatively skilled at this, which is what makes some of the interaction so intriguing. Foreman being able to deduce the bisexuality of 13 is a great example of the solid conversations that this proficiency can foster. Whereas most other shows would have likely made it an emotional coming out story or perhaps just another dramatic plot line, it is instead brought up in a conversation about pigeonholing.
No one can describe themselves in 10 words. Why would we want to hear anyone else do it?
So you keep it a mystery. No categories if no one knows anything.
Do you think maybe you're oversimplifying me now?
No. I'm sure you have many reasons to keep yourself a mystery, besides the fact that you're bisexual. The denial would have worked before the long vacant stare.
It's clever. Rather than making her sexuality the main focus, it brings to light this part of 13's character. She likes to keep her life as private as possible and is averse to opening up to people while simultaneously planting the seeds for Foreman becoming too much like House. Not caring about the privacy of others and deducing things simply on the way another person behaves or the things that they say. And finally, the relatability. House, although fictional, is one of the most personally relatable people I have ever come across. Now, I don't necessarily think I'm some tortured genius. I can be quite a dullard at times. but I heavily relate with so many aspects of his persona that I sometimes find it hard to accept his non-existence. He's an introverted, self-indulgent, sarcastic asshole and an atheist who doesn't trust anyone and is afraid of getting close to people. Anyone who really knows me will easily be able to make the comparison. I tend to share his views on relationships, friendships, politics, science, and humanity in general, but I try to avoid letting the harsher aspects of his personality dominate my interpersonal life. I know that acting the way that House does is simply not manageable and presents too many problems in the long run. Hell, any person acting the way House does and doing the things he does would be fired almost immediately. No profession would allow the things that he gets away with. I mean, this guy breaks every rule in the book.
Get this thing out of my sight!
Well, wait a second. How are you going to play by the rules if you don't have the rule book?
And this show really helped usher in the wave of the difficult protagonist, the antihero. People often wonder how anyone put up with House. And the main reason obviously being how proficient he is at his job, but this type of arrogance must be earned. It would be interesting to see a younger Gregory House and how he behaved before being in any position of respectability. And despite the fantastical nature of it all, I believe a good amount of people can relate to this character in one way or another, and that's what makes it so well crafted. He embraces the rational and analytical aspects of life, and tries to be as objective about everything as possible, even to the annoyance of others around him, standing by his conviction that ideas are bigger than feelings. Something I align with 100%. I am sometimes too analytical of situations. People come to me with their woes, or I have my own emotional problems to deal with, and instead of empathizing with them or dealing with my emotions head on, I end up seeing it as a logistical problem and trying to figure out the most efficient way to deal with it, oftentimes avoiding the emotion altogether. To quote Wilson, why is it that in Houseland an emotional problem can be sidestepped by turning it into a mechanical one?
Because in Houseland, and the rest of the universe, by the way, when a question presents itself, it calls for an answer.
I overanalyze everything because I want the best possible answer. This heartlessness that can be put off the most can be such a breath of fresh air from the usual platitudes and vapid statements that are meant to be comforting. Wilson makes a remark to House that seems to encapsulate the essence of what I think makes the character so refreshing and respectable. House, being worried that his personality is too much for Wilson to handle and fearing losing him as a friend, asks him if their relationship bugs him because he is so brazen and they have no social contract. And Wilson simply replies, "My whole life is one big compromise. I tiptoe around everyone like they're made of china. I spend all my time analyzing. What will be the effect if I say this? Then there's you. You're a reality junkie. If I offered you a comforting lie, you'd smack me over the head with it. Let's not change that." This line perfectly explains why House and Wilson's relationship works so well. And not only that, but if there were ever two words to encapsulate House, reality junkie might take the cake. Someone on a noble quest for truth and a need for answers. As 13 put it,
You spend your whole life looking for answers. Because you think the next answer will change something, maybe make you a little less miserable. And you know that when you run out of questions, you don't just run out of answers. You run out of hope.
This line probably hits me the hardest of all. Is my obsession with truth and rationality simply a coping mechanism to mitigate life's misery and give me a sense of purpose? Another time he analyzed House to perfection was when Wilson had lied to House, and in a rare instance, House was unaware. They were discussing a faith healer who believed he had the ability to speak to God, and thus Wilson throws an accusation at House criticizing his need for control. "You're not even mad because I lied to you. You're mad because I lied to you and you couldn't tell, and that's why religious belief annoys you. Because if the universe operates by abstract rules, you can learn them, and you can protect yourself. If a supreme being exists, he can squash you anytime he wants." House simply retorts, "He knows where I am." This hit the nail on the head on a huge personal resonance with the character. The universe does indeed operate by objective abstract rules, and the more that you learn about these rules, the more you can protect yourself from a world that would otherwise exploit your ignorance, i.e. deduction and body language reading, but also in other areas of life. To quote astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, "Science literacy empowers you to know when others lie about objective realities." As trite as it may sound, knowledge is most certainly power. You can control your life as much as possible if you properly equip yourself to do so. You may not be able to control other people, but you can learn to read them and to respond accordingly. Every action will have a consequence, and if you meticulously select your actions and anticipate the reaction of others, the consequences can be predicted. And this is what House does time and time again. Now, on the flip side, not everything is under our control. Sometimes we simply fall victim to unavoidable or unforeseen circumstances, bad luck as it were. And other times we make mistakes, whether it be losing a loved one, a job, or a relationship. Things happen. Trying to change something that is unchangeable is by definition an impossible task. So the sooner that you accept that it happened and it is no longer within your control, if it ever was, the sooner you can regain a grasp on your sanity. I believe this lesson was subtly bestowed upon us when a character on the show commits suicide. There doesn't appear to be a logical or even illogical reason behind it. It simply is, and this infuriates and it destroys House internally. He must have an answer for everything. There must have been something missed. Somehow this could have been foreseen and prevented. Something like this doesn't just happen. And this drove House from embracing the rational to becoming irrational and suspecting murder where there was zero reason to suspect such. He is literally driven to insanity because he cannot accept that sometimes events happen that cannot be predicted or explained irrationally. Not only this, but he is reluctant to admit that he cared about the victim. It meant something to him that someone he had consistently been around for years had fallen victim to this tragedy. He felt partially responsible, and yet he felt betrayed by someone he held in high regard, someone he thought was like him. Because he lives in constant pain physically and emotionally and usually holds it in, deals with it with his own vices, never begs for sympathy or help, and is still able to be a sarcastic prankster who tries to get his friends and the people around him to enjoy life while also embracing the darker truths. So when someone takes their life, he sees it as a cop-out.
Just doesn't want to live in pain.
Life is pain! I wake up every morning, I'm in pain. I go to work in pain. You know how many times I wanted to just give up? How many times I've thought about ending it?
Pain is better than nothing. When Cuddy tells him that he has a right to be sad as the person who killed himself thought like he did and pushed boundaries like him, he quickly responds, "If he thought like me, he'd know that living in misery sucks marginally less than dying in it." Throughout the show, there were a number of instances in which my partner at the time, who would often watch with, would turn to me and say, "That is you. That is so you." I couldn't help but smile because,
well, quattro demonstrative.
For starters, his constant use of sarcasm and always having to have some snarky quip at almost everything people say.
Talk screen was clean. He did, however, get hit by a bullet. Just mentioning.
He was shot?
No, somebody threw it at him.
I love sarcasm. It's one of my favorite things ever. Just being able to make people laugh is something I've always loved. It feels great, as I'm sure most people know. Plus, there's just something about being able to take an otherwise serious situation and make it not so serious. It's satisfying to be able to disarm someone with words, catch them off guard. But it feels even better when someone throws quips back at you. Life doesn't have to be so serious, and I try to keep levity in mind wherever possible. I do this so much so that when I am genuinely nice and not sarcastic, people are either flabbergasted or simply don't believe me entirely. Much like House, despite me having a good heart at my core, people have this impression of me being incapable of being nice or showing affection.
Why do people believe I'm incapable of doing anything nice?
Experience.
It also helps me avoid opening up to people. I don't like talking about feelings, and I don't really have to if I treat everything facetiously. Unhealthy? Perhaps, but that's between me and my therapist. I just can't help myself, like House cracking jokes even when being held at gunpoint.
What about an X-ray or something?
Good idea. Oh, damn. I left my CT machine in my other pants.
Then there's House's idiosyncrasies or peculiar views of societal norms. House is an introvert that despises small talk and pleasantries, but when a philosophical or practical debate is brought up, he thrives in that conversation. His instinctual need to negate things people say and stand up for reason kicks in. And this is most definitely me. For whatever reason, I thrive on intellectual arguments. Sometimes on people who aren't looking for one. I just want to turn everything into some syllogism or some rational argument where I can convince the other person of something. I can be far too truculent. Although admittedly, I have gotten much more proficient at holding more typical conversations, and I try to avoid too much confrontation now unless need be. But his habits are all too familiar, like his need to be alone even when in a relationship. Although his only serious relationships was his ex-wife Stacy and Cuddy, with a few flings in between, each of them managed to make me feel and hurt vicariously. When his ex-wife Stacy came around, the feelings he had for her were reignited. After some back and forth between them, she tells him that she still has feelings for him but can't be with him. He was smart, sexy, and funny and was the one and would always be the one. But when she was with him, she felt alone. With her new husband, she felt like there was room in his life for her. However, eventually she caves and realizes she really does want to be with House. But then House, as is his wont, decides that it's in both of their best interests to not move forward. He analyzes the situation and uses reason rather than emotion, as hard as it is for him to do.
I can't make you happy.
What?
How do you think this is gonna end? We'll be happy for what? A few weeks, a few months. And then I'll say something insensitive, or I'll start ignoring you. And at first it'll be okay. It's just House being House. And then at some point you will need something more. You'll need someone who can give you something I can't. You know I'm right. I've been there before.
As reasonable and as thought out as this was, there was likely a part of him that felt like he didn't deserve to be happy. His misery is what makes him him. So he justified staying that way, even though his justification made complete sense. Whereas most people would cave and give in to emotions in a heartbeat, House has the conviction to remain rational. I love that. Then there was Cuddy. When it came to House's relationship with her, even here, perhaps most of all, I was able to relate. He had cared for her since the beginning, and this is why he seemed to treat her worse than most. He had to keep her at arm's length to avoid getting close to her, which would put him at risk of being hurt. His constant need to analyze things and anticipate future problems or being wary of being happy reminded me a lot of myself. When House questions what if he isn't right for her because her loving him was a bit impulsive and perhaps not rationally thought out, she asks, "Why do you have to analyze things to death? Why can't you just let it be nice?" This almost felt like a personal attack. Even during the seemingly petty arguments, it reminded me a lot of myself. They were fighting because he accidentally used her toothbrush and didn't take out the trash.
I was still half asleep. I wasn't paying attention.
And you're always right. And I don't mean you always think you're right, but you are actually always right. Because that's all that matters.
That doesn't even make sense. What, you want me to be wrong?
I want you to care about more than just what you want. What you think. You need me, House. And you may even love me. But you don't care about me. And I deserve someone who does.
How relatable this was to me. I too often lose track of what is actually important or how the other person feels and simply want to win some argument. That is what I'm used to, logic versus logic. It's sometimes difficult for me to consider other variables. Just because I'm right doesn't necessarily mean I'm right. Perhaps I am logistically, but at what cost? Even throughout the relationship, as happy as he was and as much as he loved her, his rational side knew it could not last. They simply were too different. He wasn't who she needed. His fears come to fruition when Cuddy believes she may be dying of cancer and House is too scared to visit her in the hospital until he finally does so, but he's high on Vicodin. This in turn makes Cuddy realize that she can't be with him forever like she thought she could.
Everything you've ever done is to avoid pain. Drugs, sarcasm, keeping everybody at arm's length so no one can hurt you.
As opposed to everyone else in the world goes looking for pain like it's buried treasure.
Pain happens when you care. You can't love someone without making yourself open to their problems, their fears. And you're not willing to do that.
I could do better.
I don't think you can. I'm sorry.
No. Don't.
I thought I could do this.
Don't. Please don't.
Goodbye, House.
This scene. The sarcastic, wisecracking doctor who spent his life avoiding emotions until finally opening up and loving someone reduced to begging. No, please, don't. One of the first and last times House ever pleaded with someone. He had opened himself up, let her know him, the real him, and it ended here. Her words pierced me like daggers. I felt every ounce of pain inside House's eyes. I broke down when watching this. How was this possible? A show capturing my mirrored real-life emotions like a ship in a bottle. In this moment, I was House, and House was me. He knew this moment would come, and yet it didn't make it any easier. He wanted to believe he could change, that he could do better. That he could be the person she wanted him to be, but deep down he knew he couldn't. He was who he was to his very core. He knew that he wasn't right for her. They simply weren't compatible. Was he really right for anybody? Nobody could ever truly understand him. And the most painful part is that Cuddy was likely the one person in his life who actually did understand him. But understanding is not the same thing as embracing. Acceptance would never come. He was alone. They had both fooled themselves, if even for a while, into believing that they could accept each other's differences and live for the good. But this simply wasn't feasible in the long run. He had sacrificed self and efficiency as a doctor for her because he cared, and yet it was all for naught. House was broken. I was broken. An earlier quote from Dr. Chase echoing through my mind. If you want to be special, you're going to have to be alone. Either we live in normalcy and contentment, or we take what makes us unique and embrace it by its very definition and have no one to relate to. We are who we are, to thine own self. Shortly after his breakup, he picks up 13 from prison. The two catch up and he tells her about what happened with Cuddy. After first thinking he's joking, she sees the pain in his eyes and realizes he is being truthful. Oh my god, I'm sorry, are you okay? I'm fine, it's no big deal. Obviously. But even in his most vulnerable moments, he never liked to burden others or seek out sympathy. He was too prideful. And perhaps he was even trying to fool himself.
Today would have been our 1-year anniversary. Which is an incredibly arbitrary thing to celebrate.
This hit me harder than it was probably intended because I am so averse to opening up to people as well as burdening them with my struggles. Even when suffering internally, on the outside I'm still the sarcastic, indifferent, invulnerable guy everyone has come to know me as. I don't do this to be noble, it's just how I am. I've never known another way. House can't figure out specifically what 13 was in prison for, and eventually after constant persistence from him trying to divine what happened, 13 breaks down and tells him what she did. She had to euthanize her own brother who also suffered from Huntington's. The disease was so far progressed that he didn't have much time left and was flailing and made no sense, but in his few moments of lucidity, he would let her know that it was time to let him go. He wanted to be set free, so she did it. She injected him with morphine and put him to rest. She knew they would get her on the drug charge, but they couldn't prove she pushed a plunger that killed him. Her emotions poured out like a broken dam. And yet House was quiet.
And one day, I will be that sick, and there will be no one there when it's time. I didn't expect compassion from you. I would have taken commiseration. Hell, I would have taken revulsion. Any emotional engagement at all. It's no wonder Cuddy broke up with you.
This scene hit me close to home. In my relationships and friendships, there are so many instances in which the individual emotionally vents or tells me about some serious issue, on the verge or sometimes in tears, and all I can do is quietly stare off into the void. Not because I'm not listening, not because I don't care. I never know what to say in these moments. It takes me a while to take in everything that was just said to me, to really absorb the gravitas of the situation. Then I run through thoughts in my mind about how to respond to what was just said. I don't want to respond with some comforting lie or some cliche. I want a reasonable and tactical response. Some way to rectify or fix what was just said, even though I know this likely isn't possible. I know now that any response is better than none, but I simply don't function that way. Too many thoughts running through my mind. Too many calculations. Why did this happen? How did we get here? How can I fix this person's problem? I need to fix it because I care about them, but I'm not sure how. Should I say this? No, say this instead. After all this, it's usually too late. The person on the receiving end of my deafening silence takes this as a sign of indifference or callousness. I knew this is exactly what was happening with House, or what was intended by the writers anyway. It's not that he didn't care, he was processing it all, relating it to his own life, making mental assessments. It was such a relief emotionally to know that I wasn't alone. I never quite knew why I do this, and I never knew anyone else who did or understood. The fact that House cared but simply was stuck in his own head was solidified when later that day he tells 13 while dropping her off at her place.
I'll kill you. when the time comes if you want me to. But do it now if you like. Yeah, I've got a baseball bat in the back.
I'll see you Monday.
Despite not directly acknowledging what she said, the sheer emotional relief on her face, like a weight lifted off her shoulders, told it all. She needed to hear it. House was being compassionate. He had no ulterior motive, no agenda. How much more powerful it was for him to tell 13 this rather than a "I'm sorry" or "I'm here if you need me" when she had first confessed. He had to process, to evaluate. I always admired the relationship House and 13 shared, not to mention Olivia Wilde is just great as an actor. They had this understanding of each other that was unique. 13 was always able to see through House's sarcasm and get down to the heart of the matter at hand, and House sees her as his enigmatic friend. They share a unique bond, although House will never admit this, of course. Even when he does something heartfelt and self-sacrificing, he has to put up the veneer of having different motives. I resonate with this. For whatever reason, it's hard for me to do nice things. I do them in my own unique way and usually have to downplay how nice I'm actually being. The best example of this is when 13 wants to leave the country with her girlfriend to enjoy the rest of her life and give up on medicine, but House wants her to stay and be a part of his team.
Guilt. You feel guilty about leaving.
Yes, I think that little of you and that much of me. You're nothing without me.
Not leaving me, leaving humanity.
I'm going with my girlfriend, the woman I love.
To have fun.
I just want to be happy.
No one's unhappy in Greece.
He respects her as a doctor and, more importantly, a friend. He spends the episode trying to convince her, and even she has doubts.
I don't know, House. I mean, what am I supposed to do?
So, guilt.
Yes, you were right. You were always right. I have the skills to help people. Is it okay for me to walk away from that because I want to just have fun?
Eventually, she decides to stay and continue to help people with House, but he fires her. But look at the way he does it and her reaction.
You're fired. Don't come in tomorrow.
House. You're trying to save me.
Yes. I think that little of you and that much of me.
Bye, House.
He won't say it out loud, but he's firing her to free her of her guilt. He wants her to enjoy the rest of her life, so he's giving her an out, putting up the veneer of no longer wanting her on his team when in reality he's making a selfless sacrifice to put his friend's happiness first. You see, House isn't always a selfish ass. Now, let's talk for a bit about the criticisms this show receives, starting with the more layman critiques, from people who I've spoken to who aren't big show buffs and simply watch casually, aka like normal people, and this is what I've heard. I don't like his sense of humor, it's weird and rude, and the show is too predictable, every episode is the same. These two things I find repeated most often as to why people didn't enjoy the show or never got into it. I addressed them briefly at the beginning of the video and they aren't inherently wrong, it's simply a differing of taste and what you are hoping to get when you sit down and watch a show. The humor is a hit or miss, either you like the style or you don't, and if you don't, you definitely will have a hard time getting through the show as it's such a big part of it. The show consists of mainly witty insult humor and observational comedy, both of which I love. A stark contrast from a lot of other shows which feature sitcom and situational comedy. This isn't to say that one is better than the other, it simply comes down to personal preference, and if you aren't a fan of witty insults, then I won't judge you for being wrong. As far as the show being too predictable, it can be. It's a procedural show and naturally follows the same formula for mostly the entirety of the series. But they do find clever ways to switch it up every now and again, which I admire. But I don't watch the show because I want a different formula every episode. There are plenty of dramas with overarching storylines that span multiple seasons, often for way too long than was ever necessary. And those can be good too, but with House, you know what you're getting. It's not about if House is going to cure the patient at the end of the episode. It's about everything that we've discussed. Everything that happens before that. The medicine and the patient are simply a supporting story device that usually parallels some personal dilemma one of the characters is facing. The formula to each episode is simply the skeleton. The dialogue, the acting, the writing, the subtle life lessons, and the raw depiction of reality, the philosophical and moral quandaries, and the emotional resonance. That's the meat on the bones. If you choose to watch the show and throw away the meat and eat the bones while complaining about not being satiated, then the fault lies with you and your inability to recognize good sustenance and not the chef's. More avid critiques claim the show gets too absurd and some of the things that happen are simply ridiculous. I agree. Somewhat. Sure, there are times when the show can be self-indulgent and there are episodes such as House being kidnapped by the CIA or kidnapping a TV show star, or even the aforementioned shocking himself to experience death. All extremely fantastical things that would obviously never happen, but I am able to suspend my disbelief for the sake of levity and entertainment. It fits the over-the-top character of House. I think the show does a great job of walking the fine line between not taking itself too seriously and yet maintaining poignance, similar to what Breaking Bad does. As great as that show is, there's no denying that sometimes it was over the top and self-indulgent, but that didn't detract from the overall quality. A lot of the fans often hate on the later seasons, specifically Season 8, claiming the show jumped the shark and was out of ideas, but I disagree. I think Season 8 was great. It started to recapture the magic of the first seasons. The comedy, although sometimes hacky, was funnier than ever. There's no doubt that the themes and stories were starting to be repeated, but it also got to explore more modern concepts and be recorded with more clarity. There's a part of me that laments that this show hadn't started a bit later so that it could be more modern, but despite this, it holds up well. Had the show gone on any longer, it definitely would have gotten stale, but this final season, in my opinion, was a solid wrap-up and farewell to the House we all know and love. I won't say the show was underrated. It wasn't. At one point, it was one of the most watched shows in the world. There have been well over a dozen medical shows within the past decade or so that have given their shot at creating good television. Almost all of them have failed or remained relatively obscure. There are only a handful, if even, that gained prominence and achieved mainstream success. House was one of those. It was executed brilliantly and did what it did well. I realized that for most, House was simply a show that they could sit down, relax, and watch during an evening of rest from the monotony of some underpaying job, a show that had enough comedy and drama to keep them watching. The average viewer isn't going to analyze or appreciate the show on a level that a fanatic such as myself will. This is fine. Without the casual viewer, the show likely would have not survived long enough for there to be a multifarious masterpiece that we have today. It was the perfect blend of philosophy, tragedy, drama, comedy, and routine all rolled up into a ball of common sense. It prompted people to think about the prominent issues and pushed the envelope for presenting logical and reasonable arguments against strongly held beliefs. There aren't many other shows where the main character is openly and brazenly an atheist and most importantly a skeptic. It's laudable. One of the most complex, beautifully written and executed characters ever created. To this day, when I'm feeling a bit down or worn out, I can sit down in front of the television, relax, and throw on an episode of House M.D. and feel calm, as if I'm hanging out with a friend, a like-minded individual. There have actually been studies on this, and our brain is incapable, to a certain degree, of telling the difference between real and false relationships. This is why we get so attached to TV show characters. We build a bond with them that seems real. We find a sense of belonging. And as Wilson told House after discovering a religious self-help book that House was reading was actually his estranged biological dad's, "You're alone. You've been alone your whole life. When you read that book, you were hoping that somewhere underneath all that talk of God, there would be a way of thinking, a mind that you could recognize. You wanted what we all want. The power to transform into any water-based object?" House retorts. "No, House. To look across the gulf and know there's someone else like you." And while House may not have found what he was looking for in that book, I found it in House. Someone like me. Someone who strives to be as rational as possible, perhaps annoyingly so. Someone who tries his best to avoid letting the cacophony of emotions that life presents overwhelm him. Someone who sees the value in sarcasm and banter. Someone who embraces the harsher truths of life that most don't want to face. Someone who is afraid of getting close to people but yet is scared to admit that he appreciates and wants the best for those closest to him. Someone who took life's pain and embraced it in silence. Wasn't afraid of attacking bad ideas head on or being blunt when it mattered. Someone who valued his mind and his ability to reason above all else. Didn't believe in happy endings. Someone broken. Someone who deep down knew how to love but was too different. Someone extraordinary. It was a bit of respite from the real world. An escape. A moment of sequestered solitude from the pandemonium that is life. A show that is there for me when I feel alone. A show that I identified with, so much so in fact that I occasionally catch myself walking with a very subtle subconscious limp. Like some sort of strange idiomotor effect that I promptly correct while chuckling to myself. This show has given me the confidence to not be ashamed of who I am. As cliche as it may sound, we are all unique. Every person's life experience is viewed through an entirely different lens than another. Even to those closest to you are supporting character while they live out their main roles. Take pride in the things that make you you. The sum of all our life experiences, good and bad, are what add up to make you special. Learn from them. Accept them. This isn't to say that you should avoid change. Even House transformed for the better despite his insistence that people don't change. But he never lost sight of what made him unique. He simply rounded off the rough edges. David Shore and the entire cast played their parts perfectly, and a masterpiece was created. I would like nothing more than another show to come along that captivates me in the way that House did, that provides me with just as much solace and intellectual sustenance. But as the philosopher Jagger once said, you can't always get what you want.
You're right. I feel much better.